Well, what is the right text? Men like Mark Ward and James White, along with the good doctors at Central Seminary and places such as that, like to throw back at us, well, if the TR is the right text, which TR is the right text? In fact, I had somebody say to me just today, and very sincerely asking me, well, aren't there about 27 different versions of the TR? Well, the answer to that is no. But that thought proliferates out there, and they try to undercut. By the way, I don't usually use the word TR. I prefer the term traditional text. The term received text or textus receptus, which is the Latin of that term, did not appear until 1633 when the Elsevier brothers in Leyden, Holland produced a printed edition of the traditional text. And in the foreword, they made this comment, textum ergum habeles nun ab omnibus receptum. I'm sure you all understood that. It usually is shortened to textum ad omnibus receptum, which just means a text now received by all. And from that has come the idea of textus receptus. And I don't mind if you use that term, but I prefer to use the word traditional text because the word, or I should say the traditional text, existed long before the received text, the term was invented. Now, Erasmus is routinely accused of creating the received text, or the TR. But what Erasmus actually did was put the traditional text into print. He never heard the term received text or textus receptus. Now, Erasmus produced 5 editions, and by that I'm talking about printed editions of the Greek New Testament. When he passed, another man by the name of Robert Stephanus continued printing New Testaments. And after Stephanus passed the scene, another man by the name of Theodore Beza produced 10 editions of the Greek New Testament, that is in print. And not to mention later on, Scrivener, which we'll talk about here later this afternoon. Now, these several textual printers were not trying to find new manuscript evidence to tinker with the text as many modern translators do. In fact, Erasmus was the only true textual editor. Robert Stephanus was basically a printer by trade and by profession, though he did edit his work to the degree of fixing typos and reformatting pages as they went to different size print editions. And likewise, Theodore Beza was primarily a printer by trade and profession. And he also would edit only to the degree of changing misspelled words and typographical errors. Now, our textual critic friends would have us to believe that there are numerous differences in all these various editions of the Greek New Testament. And let me just say this. Today, when we talk about an edition, for example, one of my books back there is in its 3rd or 4th edition, and today that means we've made changes along the way. Changed a word here or a paragraph there or added a section there. But when we're talking about editions of the Greek New Testament, the word that would probably be more accurate is the word reprints. And so we talk about 5 editions of Erasmus, and I'll get to him just here momentarily. But in most cases, the only differences in these various editions are printer's errors, or as we would call them today, typos. Letterpress printing of that day was prone to printer errors. And the print technicians and in the print shops were often not fluent in Koine Greek, and typos were made. Now, Erasmus did make several textual changes in his 2nd and 3rd editions. Principally, 1 John 5:7, which he retained, and the last 6 verses of Revelation. In Erasmus' 1st edition, he was in a hurry to get his Greek New Testament into print ahead of a group in Spain which was producing what was called the Complutensian Polyglot at Complutense University in Spain. And it, among other things, printed the traditional text of the New Testament. But it did not actually get into print until, or at least published in the public domain, until after Erasmus got his work done. He was in a hurry. And so because he wanted to be the first to put the New Testament into print, he back-translated 6 verses from the Latin. And there's some question today whether it's the Latin Vulgate or the Vetus Latina, which is a name meaning the Old Latin, which had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Erasmus had a copy, in fact, the only manuscript he had that contained the book of Revelation, he thought went clear back to apostolic times. It was that old, he thought. Now, whether it was or not, we don't know. And because of its antiquity, it was missing the last page, and therefore, which had the last 6 verses of Revelation, and therefore, he back-translated from a Latin text. But by the time he got to his 2nd and 3rd editions, there was no question about the integrity of either the last verses of Revelation or 1 John 5:7. And so the actual text of his succeeding editions therefore changed little, basically just fixing typos or changing spelling words or changing the format to a different size when it was printed. There is very little difference in those various editions of Erasmus. And by the way, Stephanus' text is basically Erasmus' text. And Beza's text, for the most part, is the same as Erasmus. But so we're back to the question we started with this evening, or this afternoon: what is the right text? Now, recall that even to this day, going to the manuscript side, we've been talking about the print editions here, but going to the manuscript side, even extant manuscripts of the traditional text do have a few variations. Yes, there were occasional scribal errors, such as misspelled words, missing diacritical marks, occasionally an omitted word or transposed words. But usually, simple contextual reading reveals such errors, and certainly comparison with other manuscripts usually clears up any discrepancy. And we're always told, well, there's no 2 manuscripts alike. Well, yeah, that's because, again, there'd be a misspelled word or a missing diacritical mark. That means an accent mark. Very, very, very minor differences. But they keep saying, well, what is the right text? And so guys like Mark Ward and James White and Kevin Botter at Central Seminary, to name a few, are quick to ask, which one is the right one? And in my view, today that is a red herring, because the King James Bible has already been translated. We already have it. Now, that's the introduction here this afternoon. Let me share with you 10 thoughts today on this general issue, this greater matter. And I believe point number 1 is going to be the main thought of this message. And here is point number 1, ladies and gentlemen. In all the debate about the right text, we forget that God knows what is precisely the right and perfect text. God knows what the right text is. Now, he knew it all along. He is the author and the ultimate publisher of his word. Now, I am an author and a publisher. We publish most of my books through our own publishing concern called North Star Ministries. But a few of our books are printed through outside publishers. I am acutely aware if there are differences in the published text from what I submitted to the publisher and what turns out. And that's happened several times. We submit a manuscript to the publisher, and when it comes back, they changed a few things here and there. Well, I'm acutely aware of that. And it has happened. And I therefore take steps with the publisher to correct the matter. Now, here's the point. If I do that to deal with one of my books, can we not therefore believe that God is concerned about deviations in His book. And I believe God has seen to it in the greater scope of the matter to ensure that the publication of His Word, particularly in the traditional text, and as we'll see in a moment in the King James Bible, God has taken steps to ensure that it is the right text, word for word. And so, number two, has God given us any clues to what that precise and correct text is? Well, the answer to that is yes. And of course, the critical texts are not even in the ballpark. I mean, it's not even up to consideration as far as I'm concerned. They are utterly corrupt. But what about the alleged diversity of differences even in printed editions of the traditional text, which, by the way, are minuscule? Again, God knows the precise text and does so to this day. I mean, He is the author. He's the publisher. And so, number three, this afternoon, let us consider a major clue which God has given us. Now, our critical text friends, if we can be kind and say that, are always talking about manuscript evidence and textual variants. I like to go to the matter from a different direction. Let's talk about from this point in history and look back. There have been, now listen to this carefully, I'm going to build a case. There have been over 6 billion, that's with a B, over 6 billion copies of the King James Version published over the last 400 and some years, 414 years. It is by far the largest and most widely distributed publication of God's Word in history. By far. In fact, in my view, in my consideration, the King James Bible has more, or let me put it this way, there are more copies of the King James Bible than any other translation in the world. There are more copies of the King James Bible than all the rest put together. Now, let that soak in for a second. There are more copies that have been published of the King James Bible than all the other translations of the Bible in history. Just a few thoughts here. There have been 450 million copies of the NIV published. There have been 315 million copies of the ESV. There's been 3 to 4 million copies of the New American Standard. The New King James Version, 60 million. The Holman Christian Standard Bible, perhaps 1 million. The New Living Translation, several million. The Living Bible, 40 million. The Message, 20 million. Good News for Modern Man, which was bad news for modern man, but nevertheless, 244 million. That adds up to a little over 1 billion. And then we have other languages, but for example, our Spanish friends, the Reina Valera, in its various editions over the centuries, I mean, the Spanish-speaking world does not have, by any means, the audience that the King James Bible has had. And this is just my estimation. This is from the book of Sorenson, folks. So you can take it for what it's worth. But in my opinion, there have been less than 2 billion copies of all the Bibles translated down through the centuries. Now, that's my estimation based on the little research that I've done on this. But 2 billion of all these many translations is not 6 billion. Now, here's where I'm going with all this. Did God, by the way, it's point number 4. Did God know of the supremacy of the King James Bible in advance? Does God have foreknowledge? Yes, He does. And so I therefore believe, and this is the pith of the message here today, I believe that God saw to it that the right and perfect text was used to produce the greatest publication of His Word in history. The King James Bible is the most widely published, most widely distributed, and has had more influence in the history of Christianity than any other translation of the Bible. Head and shoulders. It's not even close. And I believe, again, that God therefore saw to it that the right text perfectly was used in its translation. And so that leads us to number 5. And of course, that basic text is the traditional text that Erasmus put into print, and more specifically, Beza's 5th edition of 1598. That is the Greek base, or the Greek text, from which the King James translators operated from, which they worked from. Now, we know also that the King James does not precisely follow Beza's 5th edition. Now, that's an interesting thought, but it's true. And the working notes of the King James translators, unfortunately, have been lost over time. There was a fire in London sometime after the translation the publication of the King James Bible, and the translators' notes were lost. But here's an interesting side note, and I can't prove this, but I'm going to share a thought with you. In the year 1669, a Waldensian pastor by the name of Jean Laguerre wrote a history of the Waldenses. And in that history, he recounts how that during the Catholic Inquisition, the Waldenses of the Piedmont, the valleys of northern Italy, the Waldenses sent their documents to Geneva for safekeeping. During the time when Theodore Beza who had succeeded John Calvin, but when Beza there had leadership in Geneva. Now that's historic fact. There's no variation or question about that. The Waldenses, in fact, did do that. But here's where it gets interesting. He goes on to assert that among those documents was an ancient manuscript of the New Testament dating back to the earliest times of Christianity, possibly used by the Italic Church. Now, the Italic Church was the lineal forerunner of the Waldenses, and the Italic Church produced the Italic translation in the year 157 AD, which incidentally was clearly of the traditional text. By the way, I've got my medicine up here. Some of you know that I've had voice troubles, and seriously, there is an ingredient in A&W root beer which helps throat issues. So I just took some medicine, and it helps a little bit. But anyway, so the allegation or the assertion has been made that the Waldenses had in possession an ancient manuscript that was sent to Geneva and thence to Theodore Beza, and Beza allegedly incorporated that into his Greek text, and of course the King James translators worked from Beza's 5th edition. Now you say, Sorenson, can you prove that? No, I can't. I wished I could, but that's a fascinating theory. It's an interesting thought. For if it is true, I mean, we have a very early translation, or very early edition, or manuscript, I should say, of the Greek New Testament, making its way to Beza, and from there the King James translators work. Now, I can't prove that. I wished I had the linguistic ability of Latin and Old French and go to Geneva and research this. Maybe someday somebody can. But there has been the allegation by a Waldensian pastor who was much closer to the situation than we are. And he made that assertion. So again, we're back to the basic question. What is the precise text? Now, there are some differentials in the manuscripts of the traditional text, and there are some minuscule minor differences in these various printed editions of the received text or the traditional text. They're mostly spelling errors. and just minor little things like that. By no means the drastic corruption we see in the critical text, where 7,800 words have been deleted and 16 entire verses have been omitted, and 250 verses have had major, 250 verses have had major deletions, I should say, changes. There's nothing like that in the received text and the printed traditional text. Tiny little things, spelling errors, and maybe a word misplaced in some of these various documents. And so what is the precise text? Well, here I believe is the answer. Number 6, F.H.A. Scrivener produced his Greek edition of the received text in 1894. It basically follows Beza's 5th edition, but not altogether. He therefore back-translated from the King James Version in those few places where the King James translators departed from Beza. And this thus reflects, I believe, the underlying text of the New Testament. Now, it's interesting that when Scrivener back-translated from the King James to produce his Greek text, I've heard as low as 46 words and as high as 58 words were back-translated. There are over 141,000 words in the received text of the New Testament. And so we're talking about just roughly, say, 50 places. That's a pretty tiny portion. But be that as it may, Beza, in fact, did, in those roughly 50 places, back-translate from the King James Version and produce Scrivener's text. Now, I had planned to stand up here this afternoon and wave around a copy of the Trinitarian Bible Society's Greek New Testament, which is the received text. And frankly, it is Scrivener's edition. And I got 100 miles down the road here the other day on the way here on Wednesday, and I said to my wife, "Oh no, I forgot to bring it." But the Trinitarian Bible Society to this day prints the received text of the New Testament based on Scrivener's edition, and I believe, and here's the conclusion of the matter, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that reflects the precise text of the New Testament. And a number of you preachers have it, and if you don't have it, you ought to get it. You can order it from the Trinitarian Bible Society in London. And so number 7, I believe that Scrivener's text published today is the correct text of the New Testament. And we've heard the story, of course, and I started out here today, of the allegation of all these differences, all these 27 different editions of the received text. Which is the right one? Well, that's the right one, folks. That is the correct text. Now, as a post-log to that, an epilogue to that, let me share just several other thoughts here. Number 8, has God also allowed the King James Version of 1611 to be purified? Now, you recall there in Psalm 12:6, the words of the Lord are pure words, purified 7 times in a furnace of earth. And I won't go into all the story behind that. But yes, there have been several efforts to clarify and standardize the text of the King James Version. When James granted the royal patent to Robert Barker, now Robert Barker was the royal printer who printed, or was given the contract to print the King James Version, or the Authorized Version as it was initially called. It was a project so large that he could not himself, at least in the time allocated, he began in about 1610, and it was released on May 2nd on 1611. He could not do it in that amount of time, and so he subcontracted to other printers in London to assist him in printing this first edition. Now, because, again, of the nature of letterpress printing, and occasionally a word would be misspelled, or occasionally word to be transposed or something, even in the first edition of the King James Version, there were differences. And of course, we know there were numbers of then ongoing editions, which basically means reprints. And we come to the year 1631, and when Robert Barker produced what was called the Wicked Bible. And that was there in Exodus chapter 20, where he inadvertently printed, "Thou shalt commit adultery," and left out the word "not." And that Bible of 1631 was called the Wicked Translation, or the Wicked Edition. Robert Barker lost his royal patent. By the way, I made the assertion here a little while ago, and I forgot to clarify on it. 6 billion copies of the King James Bible. That number is from the British Society, which has access to the patent records of the King James Bible. And I don't know if it even includes all the many Bibles that the Bearing Precious Seed Ministries produce here in America. But be that as it may, I just forgot to mention that earlier. But anyway, Barker lost his patent in 1631, and so another printer becomes involved. And again, because of letterpress typesetting of that day, there were occasionally errors. And so in 1629 and again in 1631, efforts were made to standardize the text back to what it was in the first place in 1611. These were not revisions, contrary to what Mark Ward says. These were not revisions, but rather it was simply standardizing the text back to what it should have been and originally was in 1611. We hear that, well, there's been at least 4 revisions of the King James Bible. That's not true. What was done was just standardizing the text from the numerous typographical errors which had crept in. Then, in 1762, Thomas Paris of Cambridge University was granted the authority to begin a revision to standardize the spelling of the King James Bible. Now, as we know, there were 47 actual working translators. And English at that point in history had not been completely solidified and standardized as we know it today. And of those 47 translators, some of them spelled words differently than others on the several committees, the 6 committees or companies. And so Paris set out to standardize the spelling in the King James Bible beginning in the year 1762, and also to standardize and modernize punctuation. Now, in the Greek text, there is no punctuation, but there is in the English language. And so he began to do this project of standardizing the spelling and the punctuation. Well, he died before he could get that project accomplished. And so another man from Oxford University by the name of Benjamin Blaney took up where Paris had left off and completed the standardization of the spelling and the punctuation, and he used Samuel Johnson's first edition of the English dictionary. And of course, Samuel Johnson is thought to be one of the fathers of standardizing of the English language. And so, as you've heard today already, and I'll just say it again, the Bible that we have today in our hands is the 1769 edition of the King James Bible. And it differs only in that the spelling has been standardized and the punctuation has been modernized. Number 9, our critics are constantly arguing over minute variants and differentials in the text. You see it endlessly. And we've heard it today of the various words that have been changed in the several modern recent editions of the critical text, the NSV, or the Nestle-Aland, I should say, 26, 27, and 28, and its manifestations in various translations. And there is this constant arguing over the minutia in the critical text. In my view, Paul warned about this, about striving, about words to no profit. In 2 Timothy 2:14, pardon me, a sneeze is coming on. And when you talk about it, it usually goes away. Okay, it's going away. And so number 10 here this afternoon, we don't need to go through all the minutiae and the conniptions of modern academia in trying to figure out the right text. Even the right text within the confines of the traditional text. It's sitting in plain view in Scrivener's edition of 1894, which I believe is the underlying text, the precise underlying text of the King James Version of the Bible. God knows and knew all along what the right text is. He saw to it that the translators used the proper text, and where they deviated it from in just a few places, Scrivener back-translated from the King James, and we find that in the Trinitarian Bible, Greek New Testament today. And I wished I had mine to hold up. I was going to bring it, and I forgot. But folks, we can know what the text is, and there's not been many variations of the TR. There's just one New Testament, and that's the traditional text or the received text, and it's available today if you wish to use it. Father, thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon, and bless as the final message comes tonight, and I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.